Hey everybody, my name is Mike Montgomery, and today I'd like to show you how I built this dining table and matching benches, all using 2x4s and flat stock steel on Modern Builds. The first step was to cut all of my 2x4s to length, and I set up a stop block with the miter saw to do that. Now if you plan on building this project for yourself, make sure and check out the written article linked in the description of this video. It'll have a cut list along with all of the materials and supplies you'll need to build it yourself. Now 2x4s are great, but you want to make sure and remove the rounded corners to make them look more presentable. And to do that, I used my new Ryobi electric hand planer. Now it takes off about 1/8 of an inch per pass, and so all I had to do was 2 passes on each edge to remove that corner completely. This was the first time I had tried this method, and I was really surprised and impressed with how well it worked. The edges were all really consistent and really square. Now of course you can always use the traditional method of ripping down about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch on the table saw on each edge, and that will leave you with a square corner as well. Either way, once you have all of your 2x4s prepared, you want to glue up all of your blanks. I glued up the tabletop in 3 sections so that everything would be a bit more manageable, and I also had blanks made up for each of the benches. Once the glue dried overnight, I ran them through the planer so that I had a really smooth edge, and I feel like I should mention you don't have to have a planer like this. You can always use the electric hand plane like I did earlier, or a belt sander. It just takes a little bit more elbow grease. Whenever you're gluing up a big tabletop like this, you want to do it on a flat surface. I found a flat piece of the concrete pad, then I set up a platform to glue everything up on. I used call boards to sandwich my tabletop pieces flat, then I used plenty of clamps to squeeze out as much glue as possible. And of course, because these are 2x4s and I don't have a joiner, there were gaps here and there which I filled with wood filler. Make sure you get the one that dries natural. I want to take this opportunity to give a huge thanks to this video sponsor, RZ Mask. My RZ Mask is probably the one thing in my shop that I use in literally every project. Whether I'm covered in sawdust, mixing up concrete, or dealing with the fumes of welding, the RZ Mask is the perfect solution. Unlike a traditional respirator with multiple straps that go around and on top of your head, the RZ Mask literally goes on with a single Velcro strap. And not only that, it's way more comfortable and way easier to take on and off, especially if you've got earmuffs and safety glasses to go along with it. The best safety gear you can get is the type that you'll wear all the time, and that is why I'm such a big proponent of the RZ Mask. I always have it within reach, and it's always one strap away from being ready to go. So make sure and follow the link down in the description and use the code ModernBuilds to get 10% off. What was that? 20% off? Are you sure? Wow, that's very generous. I'll let the people know. Use the code ModernBuilds to get 20% off your RZ Mask purchase. Thanks, RZ Mask. After everything was sanded, I could get my circular saw and a straight edge and cut my benches and tabletop to length. This was a big tabletop, and I couldn't cut through it with a single pass with a circular saw, so I cut one side, then flipped it upside down, lined up my straight edge, and then cut the rest of the way through the board. A belt sander can clean that up easily. I'm using 4" by 1/4 inch thick hot rolled steel for the legs on the tabletop. I want the steel of the legs to sit flush with the wood of the tabletop, so I got the Ryobi 18-volt palm router out with a 3/4 inch double flute straight bit to create a dado that metal can set in. I set up a straight edge to get my initial cut, then I was able to take multiple passes to remove the bulk of the material. Then I could just flip the fence to the other side to create a reference edge for that edge, and then the metal can sit flush into the wood. It worked! I couldn't set up a straight edge on the edge of my table the same way as I could for the top, so instead of the router, I used the circular saw to get my 2 edge boundaries laid out. Then I could hog out the rest of the material with the router the same way I did on the top. With all of my grooves finished, it was time to cut all of my metal to length. Now of course there are a million tools you could do this with, but I'm using the simplest and cheapest method possible, which is an angle grinder with a cutoff wheel. Then I put a slight bevel on any corner that was going to be welded. Welding can be pretty intimidating, but I'm using a really simple and pretty cheap setup. It is a flux core MIG welder, so it requires no gas. Plus Plus, it's 110 volts, so you can plug it into just about any outlet. 1/4" steel is probably as thick of a material you want to use with a system like this, but I didn't have any problems and it all came out really strong. Once I had my top bar welded on, I could get it back off of the tabletop and put my bottom leg in really square. I tack welded everything first, then came back and ran full beads. Now I have a full video about welding for woodworkers. The card is in the corner of the screen and the link is in the description. If you haven't welded before and you want to, make sure and go check that out. Because of the welds on the insides of the legs, I needed to cut the corners off of the dados. That way there would be plenty of room for that metal to set in there and everything else still be flat. I just used a chisel. This doesn't need to be pretty. No one is ever going to see it. Doing this allows you to put the legs into the tabletop, then pivot it into place. Remember, the legs are about a 1/2 inch narrower than the tabletop, so this is the only way that you can get the legs into place. Make sure you have a rubber mallet. Black oxide drill bits have always worked well for me drilling through metal. Just make sure and use some sort of cutting oil. I just didn't have any on hand and I didn't want to have to make a Home Depot run just for that. I also countersank all of my holes, that way the screw heads would set flush with the metal. These are stainless steel star head screws and they'll be linked in the description. You notice the table wobbling here? Yeah, I didn't expect that. I didn't know that flat stock steel had enough bend to it that it couldn't be used as frame legs. So I added this 2-inch wide piece of steel as reinforcement on the lower third of the leg, about 10 inches up. The wobble came from the metal itself flexing, not the weld joint, so adding this 2-inch piece on end made everything perfectly rigid. I also got the chance to brand the bottom of the table with my new iron from Budget Branding Irons. They make custom branding irons with your logo, and I'll leave them linked in the description.
I should have held it a little longer. That looks good though. Yeah.
I only used 3 screws on each of the legs for the benches, but aside from that, it was the exact same process. I sanded first with 150, then 220 grit sandpaper, and applied a couple coats of Minwax polycrylic. And with that, the table and benches were done. I love the functionality of having the benches be exactly half the width of your tabletop. That way you can spread everything out when you're eating, or you can tuck everything underneath the table when you're not using it, and it stores in such a small footprint.
It's interesting, at first I was pretty bummed out when I realized the legs of the table had a little bit of wobble. I didn't really like the idea of adding any extra steel. I wanted to keep the profile pretty much the same. But after adding the small brace, I really think it adds a lot to the design. Because it is a smaller piece of steel, it keeps that light feel, but it adds the rigidity that the table needs. And for those that are curious, no, the benches don't wobble at all. The wobble does not come from the weld joint, it actually comes from the length of steel. But when it's not too long like these benches, it's perfectly rigid. I can live with that. Now, if you haven't already, I would really recommend you clicking that subscribe button. That way you can stay updated every time I post another project video. And speaking of project videos, 2 will pop up on the screen right here. The top one will be another metalworking video, while the bottom one is a strictly woodworking video. Thanks again, everybody, for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your week. And until next time, this has been Modern Builds. Bye, everybody.